Hello, listeners. Today I'd like to bring you a story that you cannot find at the store or even online. It's called The Brave Frontier. It's a historical fiction story about people who lived in the Schoharie Valley during the American Revolution. The Schoharie Valley is a place in New York State, and the American Revolution was the war that our country fought for independence. Helen Fuller Orton was an author who lived in New York State. She wrote many stories about the history of New York State. The book is called The Brave Frontier because that is what Europeans called the land that they began to settle in North America when they moved over and took over land from the Native Americans. The Europeans thought of this land as wild and dangerous. And especially during this time in history, they were right. The Brave Frontier, Chapter 1, The Protection Paper. Peter Whitbeck pulled the rakeful of sweet-smelling hay into place in the windrow that stretched across the clover field, laid the big wooden rake down, and wiped the perspiration from his face. He had been helping his Uncle Wilhelm make hay since 9 o'clock, and now it was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was still high in the sky. "It's a long day," he thought. "Will supper time never come?" He glanced at his gun, stacked near by beside his uncle's. Then his gaze went farther away, to the edge of the forest that came down the mountainside. It was advisable to do that in the year 1777 in the Schoharie Valley. Seeing no suspicious movements there, his gaze switched to the river that flowed through the valley. Beyond the fringe of willows and elms that bordered it, he could see the sparkling water of the swimming hole. "Wish I could go swimming," he thought. He picked up the rake and went to work again, raking into windrows the dry clover his uncle had cut with the sieve. From this rise of ground in the hayfield, he could look down over the Schoharie Valley, which stretched on each side of the river for a dozen miles north and south. "I'd like to take a canoe some day and explore this Schoharie River to the end of it," he mused. "I'd like to go clear to the Mohawk, and then down the Mohawk to Albany." Though his mind was busy wishing, his hands never stopped raking hay. But soon, seeing a song sparrow rise from the stubble, over at his left, he discovered a nest with 4 speckled eggs. "Mighty lucky Uncle Wilhelm hasn't stepped on the nest," he thought. "I'd better mark it." With his knife, he cut 2 switches from the elderberry bush in the fence corner and stuck them in the ground, one on each side of the nest, to mark the spot. "No one will hurt you now," he said aloud. Then he went away, and before long he saw the mother bird go back and settle on the nest. He glanced at the valley before again bending over with his rake. Very beautiful it looked this July day, with the grain fields and orchards and meadows marked off by stone walls and stump fences, with houses and barns scattered over it, and the church spires in the villages. The sight of the houses made Peter think of his own home. He looked over to the next farm, where stood the empty house in which he and his parents and sister had lived. How suddenly they had come, the Indians! How terrible it had been! A gentle breeze came along and blew Peter's blond hair over his forehead as he stood there. Then his uncle's voice came. "Get to work, Peter. We must finish this field before dark." "Yes, Uncle Wilhelm," he replied, as he bent forward to reach a far wisp of hay. Without a word, the 2 of them worked, the uncle pitching into little round haycocks the hay that Peter raked into windrows. All over the valley that afternoon, men were working in small groups in the hayfields, all with their guns near or with someone walking along beside them, carrying a gun. Schoharie people knew that at any moment an Indian spy might be watching from some high place on the mountains. They knew that the Tories and Indians might make a sudden raid on the valley, so never a moment were they far away from their muskets. Peter's hands kept working fast, but Peter's thoughts could not keep from going back to an afternoon the fall before. A sunny afternoon like this one, when Indians had suddenly come down into the valley and killed his father and carried off captive his mother and sister. They would not have done it so easily if I had been at home, he thought bitterly. It is too bad that I had gone to Uncle Tunis's that day to see his new horse. Peter did not stop to think that one lad would have been of little avail against a band of 10 Indians. His arms were tired after raking hay all day, but he did not stop to rest them. A bobolink went flitting over the hayfield, its black and white coat shining in the sunlight, its song making the summer day cheery. An eagle flew over the valley, high in the sky, from Rattlesnake Mountain on the west side to the Clipperberg on the east. As Peter looked up at the eagle, his eyes were as blue as the sky. The supper horn at 5 o'clock was a welcome sound. Peter put his rake down and Uncle Wilhelm his pitchfork in a fence corner. Taking their guns over their shoulders, they started up the lane to the house for supper. "I wish I could have a swim tonight," Peter said as they neared the head of the lane. "Well, maybe you can have one, Peter. If we get the hay done in time, after sundown you may go swimming." Aunt Augusta had a good supper waiting for them. Cold ham cured in their own smokehouse, Dutch cheese, homemade bread, maple syrup, and doughnuts. 2 small children, Peter's cousins, sat at their mother's end of the table and eagerly ate their supper of bread and milk. Pretty girls they were, with the flaxen hair and blue eyes of the Palatine children. Uncle Wilhelm looked toward them with pride and joy every once in a while. Aunt Augusta had some news. "My niece stopped by today. She says the Tories are gathering every night near her home up the valley and drilling up and down the road." "Drilling? Do you mean they are drilling for war?" asked Peter. "Yes, she says sometimes there are redcoats drilling them, and sometimes they drill themselves. She says they are marching and shouting commands, and that many Indians are with them." "That looks bad. What would they be drilling for if they did not intend to make a raid on the valley?" said Uncle Wilhelm. "She says they are trying to get all the men at that end of the valley to join them." Uncle Wilhelm looked perplexed. "It's hard to know what to do these days," he said. The 2 little girls did not know what he meant by that remark, but Peter knew. He knew that the Revolutionary War was going on, and that the men who sided with the king were called Tories or Loyalists, and the men who sided with George Washington and the colonies were called rebels or patriots. He knew his father had thought the rebels were in the right, and that was why he had been killed by the Indians. The Schoharie Valley lies in the state of New York, south of the Mohawk Valley. At that time, it was the frontier, the very edge of the settled part of New York State. Beyond the mountains on the western side of the valley were great forests stretching away to the west, inhabited only by Indians. Peter knew that the Indians who had lived in the valley and had once been friendly toward the white people had gone away and were now on the king's side. Schoharie Valley is only 1 or 2 miles wide and about 10 miles long, with the winding little Schoharie River flowing through it toward the north, where it empties into the Mohawk. In the year 1777, one dark shadow hung over the valley, the fear of Indian raids. Once in a while a band of Indians and Tories would steal into the valley, descend suddenly on some isolated farmhouse or settlement, burn the buildings and kill the inhabitants, or carry them off captive. In this way, Peter's home had been raided the previous fall. Supper over, Peter and Uncle Wilhelm went back to the hayfield to finish their work. The sun set over Rattlesnake Mountain in a glory of pink and gold. Twilight came, and still they went on with the haying. "It may rain tomorrow, so we must finish all the haying we can," said Uncle Wilhelm. Peter's back ached, and he was desperately tired, but Uncle Wilhelm was feeling happy. "I have a fine crop of hay this year," he said. "I'll get a good price for it. The British will buy it for their army." "Oh, is that what I have been working for all this hot day?" thought Peter. When at last they picked up their guns and started up the lane, it was nearly dark. Suddenly, just over the fence, there appeared a man who called in a low tone, "I want a word with you, Mr. Whitbeck." Startled, Uncle Wilhelm stopped. Peter, on the other side of him, grasped his gun tighter. Then Uncle Wilhelm recognized the man as Mr. McGregor, who lived 3 or 4 miles up the valley. Cautiously the man climbed over the fence. Peter fell back into the shadow of some bushes so as not to be seen. "In this war you are on the right side, I believe," said the man. "I am on neither side," declared Uncle Wilhelm. "I till my land and raise good crops and do not care which side wins." He knew he had to be careful of what he said. "I'm on neither side," he repeated. "Let the soldiers fight it out. I only want to be left alone." "But you won't be left alone. You will have to take sides. You are either for the king or against him. And if you are against him, it will go hard with you. When the war is over, all the property of the rebels will be taken away from them and given to the loyalists who have stood by the king." Peter, in the shadow of the bushes, heard this with indignation. Had he not heard his father often say that the rebels were in the right and that they ought to win? Uncle Wilhelm was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "What must I do to be on the safe side?" "We'll give you a protection paper. Then you will not be harmed when there is a raid. We'll mark a broad arrow on your buildings to show that you are loyal to the king. Then your property will not be confiscated. When the war is over, you will have a share in the property of the rebels." "And what must I do for all this protection?" "You must not fight with the rebels or help them in any way. You must not sell your grain for Washington's army, but for the British." "I don't want to fight, but I am not so sure you will win. The rebels are good fighters. Just wait till there is a big raid. Then you'll see who are the good fighters, and they are coming before long. Think of your wife and children. Think of your house and barn." "All right, I'll take the protection paper," Mr. Whitbeck said finally. "Don't do it, Uncle Wilhelm," exclaimed Peter from his hiding place in the bushes. "Who's that?" asked the man, peering into the darkness. "My nephew. He's only a boy." "Boys can do damage to the king's side by telling." Then, walking in the direction of the bushes, he said, "Come out here, boy. What is your name?" "Peter is my name, sir." He came slowly forward, and the man threw the light of a small lantern into his face. "Oh, I remember you. You are the son of the man who talked against the king." "My father was a patriot, sir. He was for the colonies." "Well, lad, you are not to blame for that. But you had better change to our side now. You had better take one of these protection papers." "I don't want one, sir. I am not on the Tory side." "Don't be a goose, Peter," said Uncle Wilhelm. "You had better take it." The man handed him a small piece of paper on which there was some writing. Peter folded it up and placed it in one of the pockets of his shirt. "I've spent too much time with you folks," said Mr. McGregor. "There are others I must see tonight. Not a word to anyone about what has been said." He climbed over the fence on the other side of the lane, and they heard him running across the next field. In silence, the two went up the lane, each busy with his own thoughts. When they reached the farmyard, Uncle Wilhelm spoke. "Not a word to your aunt about this. It would worry her.